Hi everyone, welcome to the latest edition of Motorsport Muse, and this is all about the Romain Grosjean crash. So in my 25 years plus of watching motorsport religiously, it's definitely the worst scene of a crash that I've ever seen. I think I've seen cars go into barriers harder. Luciano Berti at Spa in 2001 is a case in point, but I've never seen a car go into a barrier, split in two, burst into flames because the battery exploded, and also the car penetrate through the barrier. So I think the most spectacular element of it was the fire, to be honest, especially the scenes where Grosjean's climbing out, being in that car for half a minute, you know, surrounded by flames, and then his visor's all melted, he's missing his left racing boot because that came off. It was just harrowing, really. Kind of brought a lump to your throat. But fire, I think, was what did it, and fire in the history of motorsport has just been always there, even if it hasn't been present in F1 really since the 90s. Now, if you go back to the 1950s, fire used to happen, but drivers wouldn't be strapped into the cars, and they did that purposely because they wanted to be thrown clear in the event of an accident. They didn't want to stay with the car in case it burst into flames. But then as you go into the late 60s, cars got quicker. They were still going to circuits like the Nürburgring, and in an effort to literally keep the drivers in the cars over the jumps, they started giving them shoulder straps and kind of belt straps to keep them in the cars. And then after the Jochen Rindt fatality at Monza in 1970, where he didn't wear crutch straps and he submarined under the monocoque in a crash and he cut his throat, all the drivers then used crutch straps. So what you had was a 6-point harness in an aluminium monocoque surrounded by fuel, and they even had fuel above the legs sometimes in auxiliary tanks. And when they went into the walls, they just burst into flames, and it was all the fuel that would be on fire. And these poor drivers trying to get his belts undone, didn't have Nomex overalls, had like cloth overalls, and a lot of drivers were killed because of fire. Probably the most famous was Roger Williamson in '73 at the Dutch Grand Prix when the car overturned, and he was largely unhurt, but he just couldn't get out of the car. They couldn't right the car, it was on fire, and he burned to death. And there was a lot of drivers in that period from like the 60s into the 70s that met a similar fate. And the other thing, of course, is the armco. So armco around that time as well started to be brought to circuits, really an effort to keep cars in the circuit and not go out into trees and things. But initially armco caused more issues, and it actually caused a few fatalities because it was being used in the wrong way. So, you know, Francois Sever's '73 US Grand Prix was literally sliced in half because the car went through the armco. Helmut Koenig, the following year at the same circuit, had a almost identical circuit to crash to Grosjean, went through the middle armco, the top one stayed in place, and it decapitated him. And also the armco wasn't secured, so the Roger Williamson crash that I mentioned, he went upside down because the car hit an armco that was just built into soft sand, and it acted like a launch pad. '75 Spanish Grand Prix, Rolf Stommelen, similar thing happened. He went into the crowd, killed a load of spectators. So what they soon realised was armco isn't a good way to stop a car. What they then brought in was things like catch fencing, which had its own issues because it used to wrap the car up in wire if it got stuck in, and poles and stuff used to hit drivers. So I think that the era of having armco at circuits is kind of gone. Maybe in the kind of parallel areas next to the circuit, but where you've got an area, service road jutting out at like a 30-degree angle that Grosjean went into, they need to be putting in things like Tech Pro that they have at other circuits, or the safer barrier that they use in IndyCar racing. But the main thing about his crash was he went from 137 mile an hour to a dead stop in about 2 meters, and he wasn't unconscious. And I think that's the most amazing thing about it. And the reason he could do that is because the monocoque was so strong. So the Haas F1 car is built by Dallara, which is an Italian chassis manufacturer that actually has quite a big footprint in motorsport. All the Indy cars are Dallaras, the F2 cars, F3 cars. A lot of they get involved in a lot of sports car racing as well. So they've got a long history, and of course they're used to building big Indy cars that are designed to kind of take big impacts into brick walls. And it's obviously been, that technology has been carried over to the F1 car. Now in the Grosjean crash, there was a big fire, but people think that was the fuel, but it wasn't. 100 kilos of fuel would be like, you know, it'd be like Vesuvius erupting. That I believe was either residual oil and fuel from fuel lines, but I think the most likely kind of hypothesis was it was the battery that exploded and that caught fire, because that was in the middle of the car that got ripped open. The monocoque itself was split, so just in front of where his legs are, there was a big stress fracture going down, hardly surprising, but the point is it didn't fail and it was still intact. But of course the main thing about this crash, 100% the halo saved Grosjean's life. Now I hated the halo when it came out. I knew eventually it would save a life, but me being a purist, I was quite vocal against it. I thought it ruined the ethos of open wheel, open cockpit racing. But I'm 100% certain Grosjean would have been killed in that crash if he didn't have the halo. And you only need to look at the photos where the armco has literally been ripped open like that, where the where the halo passed through it. Now the halo is it's basically made out of cast titanium, and it's designed to take the load of a double-decker bus, right? So it's pretty strong, but the way it's angled as well, it doesn't impact. It kind of it's at an angle, so if anything hits it, it will ride up it rather than impact into it. So you know, the overriding factor is Grosjean survived because of the halo. And another thing that hasn't been mentioned is the HANS device. Now that came in the early 2000s, the head and neck safety system, and that prevents a driver's neck from shooting forward too much under a front impact. It doesn't allow a kind of a basal skull fracture, like what happened with you know, Dale Earnhardt in NASCAR in 2001. Fairly innocuous front impact, but it killed him. So the HANS device prevents that, and the fact that he went from 137 mile an hour to a dead stop in about 2 meters and recorded about 56 G deceleration and wasn't unconscious, I think is absolutely incredible. So what can F1 learn from this crash? I think number one, keep making the cars the way that they are making them. People might say, well, hang on, the car broke in two, but it's actually designed to do that. And the fact that it broke into actually absorbed a lot of the energy from the crash. And actually the last chassis breaking in half that I ever saw, I remember in F1, was 96 at the Australian Grand Prix when Brundle crashed and the car broke in two. And believe it or not, that monocoque from the Jordan was used again. So it shows how much energy it reduces having that survival cell intact. So they need to keep making the cars. The halo is here to stay, and I'm glad, because it saved the driver. The one area they really need to focus on, there's two things actually, sorry. One is get rid of those armcos to be used as an impact point, because they just don't work. And the other one is the marshals. Now the marshal with the fire extinguisher was incredibly brave, and he's been commended by the Bahraini royal family already, but he ran across a live circuit to get to the crash site. Now I'm not criticising him at all, but what I think they need to do is probably have more fire marshals on hand, because there was one guy behind the armco where the car went up, but from what I could see he was the only one. So in those positions I'd one this side, one that side. So I think they need more fire marshals so they don't have to run across the circuit. And even later in the race when Perez broke down, you could see a marshal running across the circuit in a different spot with a fire extinguisher. So maybe some of the numbers of marshals they need to increase. And the other thing is these people are there as volunteers that don't get paid, and they put their lives on the line. And that poor guy with a fire extinguisher, you know, he's probably working in an office the day before, and on that day he's there with an open face, probably getting pretty burnt and hot, saving a driver's life in front of hundreds of millions of people. And he's just an everyday guy who volunteers to kind of, you know, marshal so that people can go racing. And I think the marshals are the heroes of the sport, to be honest, but there need to be more of them, I think, who can tackle fires like that. And finally, I think just a shout out to Romain Grosjean himself. He said today that, you know, he was almost certain he was going to die in that crash, and he had 3 attempts to get out of the car and he made it on the 3rd, and the only reason he could do that is because he was thinking of his children. That gave him the willpower to kind of get out, and also because his visor was melted, he couldn't see, so he felt this arm grab him pull him out, and that was the FIA doctor. And you know, he's a very lucky boy, and he's actually said he needs to probably have some counselling because he was, you know, that close to death, I think, on Sunday. And Grosjean, you know, is kind of man enough and grown up enough to recognise that that's going to cause him some issues. It will cause anyone issues in the future. So hopefully he recovers. I doubt we'll see him again in an F1 car. I think his burns are pretty bad on his hand. But I really hope to see him race again. And I really rate Grosjean. I still don't know. I was stood at Pouhon at the Belgian Grand Prix in 2015, and the slowdown lap, and he'd put that car, that Lotus, in 3rd position, and I still to this day I don't know how he did that. So really talented driver, really sorry that he's going to be out of F1. Hopefully he's going to end up in IndyCar. I've heard he's going to be, you know, he's in discussions with AJ Foyt to drive his car, so I think he'll go really well over there, but hope he gets well soon. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I will do another video again soon. Have a great week and speak to you again soon.